Hello, this is a video lecture introducing anatomy and physiology. So if we remember from our term sheet, anatomy is basically the study of the organs in the body, what they look like basically, and what their names are. And then physiology is the study of what those parts do, how they work together. This is all in a normal body. So when we're talking about the functions and everything of the different systems today, we're talking about normal functions. So we will talk about diseases later on, but that'll be in our common conditions class. So anatomy and physiology is what we're starting with now. So as a little bit of an introduction, we're going to kind of break it right down to the basics. So those basics are called cells. If you've ever taken a biology course, I'm sure you've heard of them. Cells are the very basic building blocks of life. They are the smallest functional parts of any animal. So there's lots of different types of cells. If you look in your textbook, you can see some examples. On page 71 of your Elsevier textbook, you can see examples. So different types of cells include nerve cells, muscle cells, epithelial cells, which make up like the skin and some of the surfaces of organs. Gametes. Gametes are the sex cells, so sperm and egg. Basically any type of cell in the body. There's so many different kinds. So each individual cell has an individual function, and then the entire body isn't made up of just individual cells. What those cells do is they group together and they make up tissues. So tissues are made up of many cells, and usually they're going to be similar cells. So muscle tissue is made out of muscle cells. So again, just like with cell types, there are many different types of tissues. So epithelial tissue made from epithelial cells, we have connective tissue, we have muscle tissue, we have nervous tissue, etc. So lots of different types. And then tissues all bind together to make organs. So organs are probably the thing that we're more familiar with because they're a little bit of a larger scale. So organs include things like the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, our skin. The skin is an organ. So those are all different types of organs. And then organs group together with other organs to make body systems. Oh, I missed the S there. Body systems. So in this AMP course, we're going to study the cardiovascular system, the digestive system, the endocrine system, the integumentary system, the musculoskeletal, the nervous, the urogenital system, which is the urinary and reproductive systems together, and the respiratory system. I think that's it. So we're going to study quite a few of those. So each of those body systems are really important to the overall health of the animal. So if the cardiovascular system isn't working well, we have an animal in heart failure. An animal in heart failure is going to die. So it's really important that all the body systems are working well together to keep the animal alive. So each system's contributing to the function and the health of the whole body. So if body systems are integral at each level, we also know that that means that their organs have to be healthy for the body system to be healthy. And for the organs to be healthy, the tissues need to be healthy. And for the tissues to be healthy, right down to the cellular level, the animal has to be healthy. So for instance, if we have an animal that's dehydrated, they're dehydrated right down to the cellular level. And that is affecting all the way up then to the body system level. So health at each level is independent on every other level. So it goes both ways. If the cells aren't doing well, it's going to affect straight up to the body systems, okay? So the degree of health at each level is going to determine whether the body as a whole is healthy. So that's just a little bit of an introduction then to our body systems that we'll be covering. So remember, body systems are made up of cells, tissues, and organs. So our first system we're going to be studying is the integumentary system. So the integumentary system includes the skin, hair, and claws / nails / hooves / oh sorry, not slash, comma, feathers, and scales. Now obviously not all of these, or even hair, not all of those are going to be present in every single animal, but skin will be. Skin is present in every animal. So the function of the integumentary system, there are lots, okay? So the first one is regulating body temp. So body temperature is an important function of the integumentary system. So a lot of these things work together to create the ideal body temperature. So in dogs and cats specifically, they are mammals. So that means that their bodies are endothermic, which means that they create their own body heat. So the skin and the hair can work together to keep the body temperature at the ideal point. So think of all those times, like we're just getting through winter now, think of all those times when you're really, really cold, right? We tend to, like our body hair might puff up trying to keep us warmer, trying to give more insulation, as well as our skin tends to like retract our blood vessels so that we're not losing as much heat through the blood vessels. On the flip side of that, we're coming up on summer, it gets mighty hot here in Winnipeg. We tend to see a lot more flushed skin, right? So we'll see like redder faces, red skin, trying to let some of that heat off. So what the skin does there is it pushes the blood vessels up and closer to the surface level of the skin so that the body heat traveling through the veins can escape through the skin. As well, you probably have experienced sweat. Sweat is a way that our bodies cool down. Dogs and cats don't have sweat glands the way we do. So, I mean, we generally have sweat glands kind of almost everywhere. Dogs and cats only have sweat glands in the bottom of their feet. So they're not able to sweat all over. So dogs tend to regulate body heat a little bit more by panting. Cats will do that too sometimes. But honestly, their hair serves way more of an insulatory purposes than ours do. So it acts as insulation. So think of like, you know those coffee cups that are like insulated coffee cups? So you can have coffee in there and it'll keep it warm. If you have like cold water in there, it'll keep the water cold. So insulation works both ways. It just helps to maintain the temperature that's inside it. So sometimes what happens is people have really hairy dogs and they think that they need to shave them in the summer, otherwise they'll be too hot. And actually that ends up messing with their body temperature regulation more than leaving them with their regular hair, because that regular hair acts as an insulation and keeps their body cool even though the outside temperature is warm. So something to consider when we're talking about body temperature and hair. Another thing that that the skin and the integumentary system is responsible for is sensation. So we can feel, and pets can feel pain through the skin. They can feel pressure. So that's like the sense of touch, right? I'll just put touch. They can feel hot and cold. So pain, pressure, hot, and cold are the sensations we can feel through our skin, and that animals can feel as well. Skin also produces vitamin D. So that's an important vitamin. Often it is present in food as well, but getting it through the sun, its exposure to the sun, the skin makes a vitamin D. So skin also secretes or excretes substances. So we have two different types of skin glands we talk about. There's sudoriferous and sebaceous. Sudoriferous glands make sweat. You see this? It kind of looks like odor in there, right? And typically sweat's kind of smelly. So that's how I always remembered that sudoriferous glands make sweat, is because that odor kind of looks like odor. And then sebaceous glands make sebum. So again, S-E-B, right? And this is oil. So, you know, if your hair is greasy and you haven't washed it in a while, that's sebum. So it's like a skin oil. It's sebum created by the sebaceous glands. And then, kind of like number one, we should almost pop it up here, is provide protection! Exclamation mark. So the skin is the outer covering of the entire body. The skin is preventing bacteria from getting into our sensitive tissues, like our underlying muscle tissues or organs. They are keeping, or the skin is like a waterproofing layer. It keeps us from dehydrating and evaporating all our liquid. The skin's pretty magical in terms of protection. We see animals often with allergies that show up in the skin, and they have really damaged skin. The skin's not very healthy. What we start to see is that animal is more susceptible to infections in general. So the skin is very important at providing protection for all the underlying layers. Hair can serve as protection in terms of waterproofing, and then claws, nails, and hooves are absolutely a source of protection in terms of defensive, right? So if you've ever been scratched by a cat or kind of clawed by your dog's nails or kicked by a horse's hoof, you know that those things can cause damage. So as well as the protection that the skin provides to the underlying layers, we also have defensive protection through those claws, nails, and hooves. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the skin now, and I'm going to draw a little drawing for you. So we do have, I'll just write up here, figure 4-8 on page 77 of your Elsevier. I'm basing this drawing on that one, but that one has a lot more details in it. Okay, so the skin, this is what we're talking about, skin right now, skin. The skin has 3 layers overall, okay? So the upper layer, the outermost, is the epidermis. The middle layer is the dermis. And the underlayer is the hypodermis or the subcutaneous. So if dermis is our reference point, the epidermis, epi means above or on top of, so the epidermis is above the dermis, and hypo can mean below, so hypodermis is below the dermis. Also subcutaneous, cutane is referring to the skin, i.e. the dermis, so the subcutaneous is below the cutane or the dermis, okay? So, the bottommost layer here, the hypodermis, is made up of adipose, adipose / connective tissue. So adipose is fat tissue. Adipose is the fancy medical term for fat. So then our epidermis, this is just many compact layers of, keratin, oh my goodness, let me try spelling this again. Keratinized epithelial cells. Don't worry about this definition. I'm just kind of giving you some info here. So basically, this is just lots and lots of really compact cells, and when they're keratinized, that just means that they have like the keratin protein in them, and it makes them more dense. So typically the outer layer, the epidermis, is dead cells filled with keratin. So they're very protective to that underlying dermis. So then in the dermis we have blood vessels, and you can see that they kind of branch up. So when I was talking about regulating body temperature, what we can do, well, not consciously, but what our body does is send those blood vessels nearer to the surface. So we get that flushed skin. I don't know about you guys, but I have a fairly pale complexion. So, you know, any type of heat and I am flushing like crazy. So my cheeks are hot pink or very red when I'm warm. So basically these blood vessels just go closer to the surface, and then that way they're carrying the heat to the surface, and then the heat can be distributed into the environment. And then we have, I'm kind of running out of room here. This thing here is the hair follicle. So the hair follicle originates in the dermis layer of the skin, and it's kind of like the hair root, right? And then everything that's above, outside of the epidermis, is the hair shaft. So the shaft is everything that we see outside of the skin. So I'm going to try to scooch this over so hopefully you can see everything. Okay. So, like we said, the epidermis then is the outermost layer, so that's the part that we can see of our skin. They're basically lots of thick layers of those keratinized cells, and then that outer layer is primarily offering protection. This middle layer, the dermis, is where all the magic happens in the skin. It's got those blood vessels, it's got the hair follicles. This is also, I didn't draw any, but that's where the nerves are. That's where the skin glands are. Any of those like sensory nerves, so pain, pressure, touch, etc., those are all located in here. And then the sebaceous and sudoriferous glands as well are all in the dermis. And then that hypodermis area is basically, there's fat in there, so adipose tissue or fat tissue, and connective tissue is in that underlayer as well. So one last thing to know about the skin, this kind of applies to skin and hair. I'm just going to flip this sheet now. So skin and hair both have a pigment, and that pigment is called melanin. So the lighter the coat of the animal, or the lighter the skin of the animal, the less amount of melanin they have. The darker the animal, the more amount of melanin they have. So like a black cat versus a white cat, that black cat has a lot of melanin. The white cat doesn't have probably any. If we have an animal that doesn't have any melanin at all, that animal is an albino animal. So you've probably seen like albino rats and albino rabbits are very common in like research. So you've probably seen pictures of those at some point, but those are like those white, they're like white and they have red eyes. So there's no, melanin also gives the pigment to the eye. So if they don't have any pigment, you're gonna end up with those red eyes. Okay, so I also just want to talk about, we've talked about the skin, I just want to talk about the 3 types of hair. So we have primary hair, Primary hair is also called guard hairs. Is also called the top coat. So primary hairs, they're characterized by being stiff, they're smooth hairs, and they're mostly responsible for waterproofing the coat. So they keep water out of the rest of the fur. Our secondary hairs are also called wool hairs, are also called the undercoat. And these hairs are really soft, they're really thin, they're usually wavy, and they're pretty dense. So these guys are for warmth, or coolness, they're for insulation purposes, okay? So if you've ever seen like a shepherd or some labs that are double coated, they've got the primary and the secondary hairs, they blow out that undercoat in the spring and the fall. So they'll have like big clumps of these wool hairs coming out. Wool hairs are usually a lighter color, so you'll have darker guard hairs and then the wool hair underneath is lighter. Also, guard hairs tend to have, like, so if this is your hair follicle, they have one hair growing out of it. Secondary hairs tend to have a whole bunch growing out of one hair follicle. So they're a lot more dense than those top coat hairs. An interesting thing about animals is that they don't always have both. So there are some animals that have just primary or guard hairs. So, primary only, that's things like Maltese, Yorkies. They have that really silky kind of fur, right? So they have a fur more like hair, the way our hair is. Then there are some animals that have secondary only. So those are things like Devon Rex cats. So they don't have any primary or guard hairs, they just have the undercoat or the wool hairs. So they're really soft, but their fur is very thin. It almost kind of sometimes looks patchy. And then sometimes we have pets that have both. So those are like your double-coated dogs. Double-coated. So like, I would say most cats, and like most dog breeds too, in terms of like, I'll just put like, you know, your German Shepherds, like retrievers. And then sometimes they don't have either. And that's things like the Sphinx cats. Chinese crested dogs. Well, Chinese crested have some hair, but they're mostly bald. Okay, so that's our two types of hair. We also have a third type. The third type is called tactile or vibrissae. So tactile or vibrissae hairs, maybe you can guess where these guys are when I describe them. They're thick, they're long, and they're mostly around the face. And these hairs aid in sensation. So they're the whiskers, are tactile hairs. So these hairs are different than the primary and the secondaries. So primary and secondary are originating in the dermis. Originate in dermis. So that diagram I showed you over here, these would be secondary or primary hair follicles, okay? Vibrissae grow from the superficial muscle layer. So they're a lot deeper than your typical hairs. So whiskers are a lot more painful to pull out. I don't know why you would do that, but So these whiskers are very important in sensation. So they can feel things a lot more readily than the other hairs. So things like, you know, a gentle breeze, or if they're touching things. So cats specifically will use their whiskers to gauge if they'll be able to fit through a space, right? So their whiskers grow to a certain length that's wider than their body, and then they can walk through spaces and tell if they're going to get stuck, because if their whiskers are touching the sides, then they know that their body's going to get stuck, kind of thing. So I had a cousin that trimmed her cat's whiskers for some reason. The cat was constantly getting stuck in places in her house. So they are very important in terms of that sensation. They get a lot of information from their surroundings from their whiskers. Okay, so I'll just go through the terms as well. Terms related to the integumentary system. So dermatology is the study of the skin. So again, using our word parts, we could have figured that out, right? Derm or dermat is referring to the skin, and then ology is the study of. So we talked about the sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are the ones that secrete sebum, which is an oil. Sometimes though, those sebaceous glands don't drain that oil properly, and you end up with something called a sebaceous cyst. So it's basically just like a little pocket at the gland site of that sebaceous material builds up. So it kind of starts to look kind of chunky and kind of cheesy looking. It isn't pus. Sometimes people think it's pus, but it's not pus. But it can be kind of squeezed out like a pimple. The thing is, it's just going to keep filling up and looking gross, and then usually people keep squeezing it and pulling stuff out, and they'll start bleeding, etc. So the only way to get rid of a sebaceous cyst is to just surgically remove it. An abscess is a localized collection of pus. So localized means it's just stuck in one area, as opposed to systemic, which would be throughout the entire body. So it's a localized infection. Usually it's trapped under the skin, and it just fills up with pus. So pus, I'm just looking here. No, I don't think we define pus in this section. But pus is basically a mix of like bacteria, debris, and just tons of white blood cells. So white blood cells are responsible for fighting infections, and they just flood the area. So we end up seeing, actually I should be showing you guys this sheet, I guess. We end up seeing abscesses under the skin then, from these infections. So abscesses are really common in cats that go outdoors, because they tend to go outdoors and fight. And then they get bit by another cat. Cat teeth are kind of like daggers almost, or needles. They go right under the skin, and then they seal up around the tooth, but they've deposited bacteria under the skin. And then those things turn into abscesses. Abscesses, honestly, are like one of my favorite things to come into the clinic, because the way you treat them is you lance them. So that means you just cut them open with a scalpel blade, and then all this like gooey liquidy pus comes out. It's so much fun. I love abscesses. They're gross. I think you have to be a special kind of person to be into them, but I love them. So atopy, this is what I was talking about when I was saying some dogs have allergies that show up in the skin. So atopy is also called allergic dermatitis. So derm being the skin, or dermat being the skin, and itis being inflammation of. So this is a hypersensitivity reaction involving pruritus. So this is an allergy situation where the skin is really inflamed. Now, oh really, it's not the next term. Okay, so involving pruritus, we'll look a little bit down. Pruritus means itching. So really itchy skin is pruritic skin, or the animal has pruritus. So, and then this is these are kind of like abnormal things so far, by the way, that we've been talking about. So acute moist dermatitis. Acute means sudden onset. Moist, well, it means moist or wet. And then dermatitis is inflammation of the skin. This is commonly called a hot spot. And it's a big bacterial infection that happens when bacteria and moisture gets trapped under the fur next to the skin, and then it turns into a big, really sudden onset, purulent mess. So purulent, remember, means having pus. So a lesion is a wound or a change in tissue. A hematoma is a collection of blood under the skin, also known as a bruise. So we'll see hematomas sometimes that are quite large in the neck area if we pull blood from a jugular vein. And birds are really prone to having hematomas because their blood doesn't clot as quickly. An ulcer is an erosion of the skin. Dermatitis, that's skin inflammation. We talked about pruritus already. Erythema means redness. An abrasion is a scrape. So like think in like elementary school, if you fell down in the playground, you'd have an abrasion, you'd skin your knee. A lipoma, so lip means fat and oma means tumor. It's a fatty tumor. Lots of dogs are really prone to having lipomas. Febrile means fever. We know that already though from our term sheet. What are two other terms for fever? So it's pyrexia and hyperthermia. And then adipose is the medical term for fatty tissues. Oh, ceramin's a special one. Ceramin's like a modified type of sebum. It's it's earwax, right? So yellowy waxish secretion in ears, earwax is cerumen. Alopecia, that means a lack of hair or hair loss. And then lastly, a furuncle, that's a localized skin infection in a gland or a hair follicle. So maybe you've had, I don't know if you've ever had one, but humans will get them and they're just commonly called a boil. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to discuss for the integumentary system. So you are able to read up on the integumentary system in your Elsevier textbook. Your chapter 4 has all the A&P stuff in it, but the integumentary system specifically is covered on pages 77 to 79. In your McBride textbook, chapter 8 discusses the integumentary system. And then as well, I have an integumentary system review, which has different review questions and etc. to kind of get you engaged with the material. So you're certainly welcome to refer back to those for practice purposes and study purposes. Of course, if you do have any questions at all from this lecture, please do ask either in the virtual classroom or in one of the chats. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.